What Nero did to Rome's virgins in private rituals shocked even the most brutal executioners. For centuries, these stories were dismissed as mere gossip, but when we look at the surviving fragments, the erased names on stone and the secret household ledgers, a darker pattern emerges. It wasn't just violence. It was a systematic ritual designed to turn sacred women into administrative objects. Today, we reconstruct the files that Nero's court tried to burn. Stay with us, because the truth hidden in these archives is more haunting than any legend. We begin with a question. Did the imperial household, under Nero's rule or in his immediate circle, use private ritual and paperwork to seize, reclassify, or control women presented as virgins, transforming intimate bodies into administrative objects? If so, how did ritual, priestly language, and record-keeping work together to make that seizure durable and socially legible? These are not merely sensational queries. They probe how institutions can convert human lives into entries on a tablet, how names are erased and reassigned, and how archives both hide and reveal those operations. If this investigation matters to you, stay with us to the end. We'll follow the files and ask you to help locate more fragments when we're done. Context: Nero's household, ritual, and documentary survival. To read this problem properly, we must situate it. The emperor's household in the 1st century CE was not a private family in any modern sense. It was a locus of concentrated power. Freedmen, imperial procurators, household priests, and court attendants moved people, goods, and legal statuses across Rome and the provinces. Ritual, acts performed with priestly words, objects, and audience, could sanctify a transfer, make a marriage lawful, or mark a dedication to a temple. In such contexts, what appears ceremonial can also be administrative. A blessing recited in a private chamber might be recorded in a tablet or copied into a register that changes a person's social standing. Our sources for this world survive in awkward fragments. We rely on a handful of literary accounts by historians who often disliked Nero and therefore shaped narratives to condemn him, on inscriptions carved in stone or scratched on lead, on papyrus and wax tablets that survive by chance in the dry soils of the eastern provinces, and on material traces, tokens, nails, erased names, that archaeologists pull from rubble. Each of these sources has strengths and weaknesses. Literary accounts provide narrative shape but are polemical. Papyri can be direct administrative records but are usually fragmentary. Inscriptions are durable but selective and sometimes deliberately altered. File A. Literary sources. What hostile historians tell us and why we must be careful. Our interpretive project begins with narrative historians. Tacitus, Suetonius, and later Cassius Dio offer the bulk of surviving prose about Nero's conduct. They paint a court of spectacle, sexual scandal, and moral collapse. Yet their distance from events, partisan aims, and the rhetorical conventions of Roman historiography compel caution. For example, when these writers describe the emperor's private life, they often rely on rumor, court gossip, and the rhetorical tool of exempla, stories told to embody vice. A passage that describes private excesses might be an indictment constructed to justify moral outrage, rather than an eyewitness report. Still, these texts are indispensable. They give texture to the period, the role of freedmen in mediating access to the princeps, the prominence of ritual specialists, and the appetite of the elite public for scandal. When we see repeated motifs across different hostile sources, patterns such as ritualized ceremonies in private settings, or the use of priests to legitimize transfers, that repetition is a clue. It does not prove specifics, but it identifies a practice worth seeking in the documentary record. File B. Documentary fragments. What registers and tablets can show. Beyond narrative are the administrative fragments, wax tablets, papyrus shreds, and the occasional ledger. These survive mostly outside Rome, in Egypt, Asia Minor, or in private archives buried by accident, but they reveal that Roman administration loved lists. Registers recorded everything from grain distributions to manumissions, property lists, and votive dedications. A household could maintain its own set of tablets, noting dependents, allowances, and disciplinary measures. Here is the critical point. Registers can convert states of being into legal statuses. A woman whose name appears in a household ledger as attached to the imperial familia acquires a new bureaucratic identity that other offices can recognize. A dedicatory inscription in a temple recording that a woman is given to the gods could, in practice, remove her from one social sphere and place her under another form of custody. Surviving documentary evidence relevant to our question is fragmentary. We do not possess a labeled imperial ritual ledger with a list of virgins and assigned tokens. But scholars have recovered private household tablets that show transfers of personnel, lists of women described with status markers, for example, designations indicating servant, freedwoman, or vota, dedicatee, and occasional marginal notes, scribal shorthand, that suggests a change in status. When a papyrus fragment shows a column with a name crossed out and replaced, the crossing is itself evidence of administrative action. Someone altered the record, and, by extension, the status it represented. File C. Material traces, erased names, tokens, and altered inscriptions. Material culture often records what literature obfuscates. Archaeologists sometimes find inscriptions or dedicatory plaques with names chiseled away, lead sheets scraped to erase inscriptions, and votive offerings whose dedicatory lines have been trimmed. These acts of erasure are not neutral, they are administrative violence made visible. The removal of a name from a public inscription can signify disgrace, reclassification, or the desire to unlink a person from a communal memory. Tokens, small objects inscribed or marked to indicate membership, custody, or exchange, are particularly suggestive. In many pre-modern societies, tokens functioned as receipts or identity markers. A ring, a cloth tag, a stamped clay disc could be used to prove a claim. In Roman contexts, we encounter seals on documents, stamped tesserae, and labeled dedications. If a woman's status depended on a token recorded in a household ledger, losing that token or having it reassigned could change her day-to-day freedoms. File D. Later reports, graffiti, and temple registers. Beyond formal archives, less formal records carry corroborating hints. Graffiti, petitions, and temple registers can preserve voices that elite narratives exclude. A scratched complaint on a wall asking for mercy, a petition to a provincial official pleading for a child's custody, or a votive tablet bearing a woman's name can resist erasure in ways formal archives do not. These sources are irregular and hard to justify as proof for a systematic practice, but they are crucial when literary claims hint at ritualized abuse. Multiple, localized petitions complaining about custody or forced reclassification would change our assessment. We must stress the evidentiary weights here. Literary motifs flag potential patterns. Documentary fragments can show the mechanism. Inscriptions and material traces show the archive at work, sometimes violently, and informal records can capture resistance. None of these by itself proves a single unified program in Nero's name. The task of the historian is to test the coherence of these traces. Reconstruction, explicitly labeled and provisional. A private ritual and its paper trail. The scene that follows is a reconstruction, a plausible composite drawn from recurring patterns in the types of sources just described. It is not presented as an eyewitness report or an attributed fact about any named person. Reconstruction. In a narrow chamber off the imperial apartments, a woman, whom we will call the composite Alia, to indicate she is representative rather than attested, arrives with a steward. Oil lamps burn low. A priest and a household scribe stand nearby. The priest's voice is measured. The scribe's stylus is ready. A small object, a stamped tessera or token, lies on the table. The priest intones words that frame the act as a dedication or an assignment. The steward speaks a phrase that, in legal register, declares a transfer of custody. The party then moves to a side table where a wax tablet lies open. The scribe uses the stylus to mark a name. If the procedure requires renaming, the old name is crossed out and a new designation is inscribed. Language that signals the woman's new administrative classification. Oil and incense mask the chamber's odors, and the tactile scrape of the stylus, the faint smell of wax and oil, and the weight of the token are the only certainties we can stage from the archives. What is important here is the combination. Ritual words that provide moral cover, a token that functions as a portable badge of status, and a tablet entry that makes the change legible to later officials. Again, this is a reconstruction informed by patterns. It is not a transcription from a preserved account of Nero's own hand. Mechanisms, how ritual and record work together to reclassify personhood. If the reconstruction seems theatrical, it is because rites are theatrical by design. But ritual in imperial Rome also had administrative force. There are several mechanisms through which ritual plus paperwork could alter a person's status. Naming and renaming. Names mattered as administrative labels. Changing a name in a register could effectively place someone in a different category. Freed woman instead of servant. Dedicatee instead of member of a household. The ritual announcement made the change socially intelligible. The ledger made it durable. Tokens and certificates, physical tokens, seals, tesserae, cloth tags, function as portable records. When an object ties a person to a household, losing the token or having it reassigned severs that tie and creates a new one. Priestly legitimation. A priest's blessing could frame an act as pious or dedicatory, obscuring coercion beneath a sacral language that other offices and communities accepted. Scribe marks and marginalia. Administrative alteration often leaves small marks, a crossed name, a marginal note, a palimpsest scraped and rewritten. These marks are themselves traces of violence when they erase prior identities. Institutional networks. The imperial household's web, procurators, temple administrators, provincials, could enforce a reclassification beyond the palace walls. A household tablet entering a man's or woman's new status could be recognized by other offices, constraining freedom of movement, marriage choices, or claims to property. These mechanisms are not unique to Rome. Across time, states have used forms, rituals, and receipts to naturalize control. But in the Roman case, the combination of ritual sanctity and bureaucratic record provided a particularly effective machinery. What was said aloud in a private room could be made legible in the public world by a scratched stylus. That legibility is the historian's evidence and the victim's captivity. Resistance and quiet sabotage. Surviving traces of contestation. The archive also preserves forms of resistance, sometimes only in negative traces. People fought back in ways that left indelible, if often subtle, marks. Hidden letters and petitions. Individuals or relatives sometimes composed clandestine letters or petitions seeking reversal of a household's claim. These could survive as copies in provincial bureaucratic archives. A petition that pleads for the return of a woman or a child reveals the human cost of administrative classifications. Marginal inscriptions and cryptic signs, a scratched name in the seams of a household ledger, a symbol added later by a sympathetic scribe, or a folded tablet tucked in a storage bundle, are evidence of deliberate concealment. These interventions show the agency of those who sought to preserve identity against erasure. Bribery and patronage. The imperial household's dependence on intermediaries created points of pressure. A slippery steward, a bribed scribe, or a petition to a provincial official could occasionally unpick a reclassification. Clandestine teaching and memory keeping. Families kept memory alive in oral traditions, in under-the-counter tokens, and in objects hidden in domestic spaces. A ring worn secretly, or a scrap of cloth with a name sewn on could carry continuity where the public archive sought to sever it. The afterlife, genealogy, reputation, and archival erasure. When a name is removed from a registry, the consequences ripple across generations. Genealogical erasure can alter claims to inheritance, civic status, and marriage. A woman whose name is recoded in a household register may have her children appear under a different patronage line. A chiseled inscription erases her from communal commemoration. A burned papyrus excises documentary proof. Over decades, these alterations reconfigure family trees, obscuring descent and complicating claims to land, status, and dignity. Archaeologists sometimes detect these genealogical distortions: a family tomb lacking expected names, a discrepancy between an inscription's genealogical formula and other records, or memorials that omit certain members. Such silences are themselves evidence. Scholarly debate and degrees of confidence. At this point, we must return to our methodological oath, never to claim certainty beyond the evidence. Scholars are divided about how far the imperial household went in weaponizing ritual and record. One camp reads the convergence of hostile accounts and material traces as strong circumstantial evidence for systematic practices. Ritualized transfers of female dependence supported by household record-keeping. Another cautions that the sources, especially the literary ones, are shaped by rhetorical agendas, and that surviving documentary traces are too fragmentary to establish a policy-directed program under Nero specifically. Crucial evidentiary issues include the following. Source bias. Tacitus and Suetonius wrote with agendas. Their depictions of Nero's excesses are often indignant and moralizing. We must treat their anecdotes as windows onto cultural perception rather than as straightforward reportage. Chronological gaps. Many papyri and inscriptions that are comparable in form date to periods earlier or later than Nero's reign. Similarities in procedure might indicate continuity across decades rather than a single imperial initiative. Documentary survival bias. The survival of papyri is highly contingent on environment. What we lack might have existed. Conversely, what survives may be unrepresentative. Ambiguity of material traces. An erased name can signal disgrace, reclassification, or a mundane correction. Tokens might be personal, ceremonial, or merely administrative. Interpreting these artifacts requires care and an interrogation of context. We assess the overall confidence as cautious. There is suggestive evidence that the imperial household used ritual and registers to exercise control over women described as virgins, but the specific attribution of coordinated policy to Nero requires more corroboration. Many instances fit patterns that recur across Roman institutions, patterns of renaming, dedications, and administrative reinscription. But direct documentary proof for a program of private rituals centered on virgins in Nero's name remains partial. Ethical considerations. How we talk about victims and archives. This investigation raises ethical questions about portrayal. We must avoid transforming victims into props for a sensational narrative. We should not sexualize their experiences or invent details to fill gaps. Our duty as historians and storytellers is to trace mechanisms and document silences, to name uncertainty, and to center the dignity of those affected. When we reconstruct scenes or create composite figures, we do so explicitly and transparently. The composite Elia is not a person attested in a source. She is a narrative device intended to illustrate how ritual gestures could have become administrative acts. Whenever we move from evidence to reconstruction, we label the move. Why this matters beyond scholarly curiosity. Understanding how ritual and record combine to reclassify persons is not an antiquarian exercise. It sharpens our sense of how institutions manage bodies and identities across time. Whether in a palatial chamber beside the Tiber or in bureaucratic offices in another era, the architecture is similar. An authoritative ritual legitimates a transfer, a scribe records the transfer, and the document circulates to enforce the result. The archive is both the instrument of domination and the place from which redress can be sought. Preserving and interrogating traces is therefore a moral as well as an intellectual task. What to look for in future research? If we are to move from suggestive patterns to more confident claims, certain lines of inquiry are promising. Focused papyrological surveys. Many administrative fragments remain unpublished or unreconciled. Targeted searches for household ledgers from imperial associates or for temple registers that deviate from expected patterns could yield stronger documentary evidence. Comparative epigraphy. Mapping instances of chiseled names, truncated inscriptions, and recarved dedicatory texts in contexts linked to the imperial household might reveal systematicities. Reassessment of petitions and private letters. Petitions pleading for custody or redress, sometimes preserved in provincial archives, could be aggregated to identify common grievances suggesting reclassification practices. Material culture analysis of tokens. Systematic study of small objects, tesserae, seals, stamped items, might clarify their use as identity devices within households. Interdisciplinary approaches. Combining legal historical analysis with anthropological theories of ritual and with forensic study of palimpsests and scratch tablets opens collaborative avenues. Conclusion. What we can say and what we must keep searching for. To return to our headline, the archival evidence suggests that in Roman imperial contexts, ritual and bureaucracy could be combined to seize and reclassify women labeled as virgins. Narrative sources allege private rituals around such transfers, and material traces show that names were erased and tokens reassigned. But the specific charge that Nero personally orchestrated a systematic program of private rituals against virgins remains contested. The case rests on patterns and suspicious fragments more than on a single definitive dossier. Our responsibility is twofold. First, to pursue the fragments, papyri, tablets, inscriptions, and petitions, with rigor, to map where administrative practice and ritual intersected. Second, to remember the people behind the entries. Names erased from stone and wax are not mere blanks for a historian's imagination. They represent lives disrupted, genealogies altered, and descendants whose claims and memories have been rearranged by paperwork. If you have suggestions, know of fragments we missed, or can point us toward inscriptions or catalog tablets that deserve re-examination, tell us in the comments. Share this investigation with colleagues who work in papyrology, epigraphy, or Roman social history. And if you want us to pursue additional files, specific papyrological collections, museum archives, or newly published inscriptions, subscribe to follow the next stages of our inquiry. We will continue to test hypotheses, to label reconstructions, and to seek corroboration rather than certainty. Sources and notes, selective, literary accounts, the surviving narrative historians, often hostile, are essential for context. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio provide portrayals of Nero's court that require careful source criticism. Their remarks should be read as both report and rhetorical construction. Documentary and material sources, wax tablets, papyri from Egypt and the eastern provinces, private household ledgers, inscriptions, chiseled or erased dedicatory plaques, tesserae, and temple registers are the types of material evidence that could corroborate practices described in narrative texts. Epigraphic and papyrological methods, the interpretation of erased names, palimpsests, and marginalia requires specialists in epigraphy and papyrology, palimpsest analysis, multispectral imaging, and careful contextual archaeology are recommended. Scholarly caution. Modern historians urge restraint in attributing organized, personalized programs to an emperor solely on the basis of polemical narrative sources. Cross-checks with documentary and material archives remain crucial. We have laid out the files as they stand. Provocative overlaps, fragmentary proofs, and clear avenues for further research. The archive gives us both evidence and an ethical duty to keep listening to the traces and to keep the names that survive in our narratives with care.